There are moments in life when we feel as though we are caught between the weight of our circumstances and the endless possibilities that lie before us. It's in those moments when the struggle seems too great and the road too long that we must understand one fundamental truth. God's hands are on you. There is no burden too heavy, no trial too great, and no obstacle too insurmountable when the hands of the Almighty are holding you up. The Creator who spoke the world into existence, who formed the mountains and the seas, is the same God who gently guides you through the stormy seas of life, holding you steady even when you cannot see the shore. God's hands are not only a symbol of His power, but they are a symbol of His love, His protection, and His provision. When you feel weak, when you feel like you're about to fall, His hands reach out to lift you, to steady you. When the darkness seems to close in around you, His hands are the light that pierces through the night. It is through His hands that you are able to find strength when you thought you had none left. It is His hands that provide for your needs, even when it seems like there is no way forward. The Lord's hands are on you. And because of that, you can stand tall in the face of adversity. We often go through life thinking that we are on our own, that we have to do it all by ourselves. But the reality is that God's hand is always there. Every step you take, every decision you make, God is there guiding you. Even in those moments when you feel like you are walking alone, trust that God is with you. His hands are always present, whether you see them or not, guiding your path. It may not always be easy and the answers may not come right away, but trust in the timing of the Lord, for His hands never leave you. Consider the story of the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness. They had no idea where their next meal would come from or how they would survive, but God's hands were upon them. He provided for them in ways they could never have imagined. When they were hungry, God sent manna from heaven. When they were thirsty, He made water flow from a rock. In the same way, God will provide for you. He knows your needs before you even ask. He knows the desires of your heart and the challenges you face. And because His hands are on you, you can trust that He will provide what you need when the time is right. God's hands are not just hands of provision, they are hands of protection. Life is full of dangers, both seen and unseen. And every day we face temptations, distractions, and spiritual battles that we cannot fight on our own. But when God's hands are upon you, you are shielded from harm. You may not always understand the battles that are fought in the unseen realm, but trust that God is fighting on your behalf. He is standing in the gap for you, and His hands are a defense against the enemy's attacks. But here's the thing, even when God's hands are on you, the journey will not always be smooth. There will be times when the storm rages, when the winds howl and the waves crash around you. Yet even in those moments of difficulty, you are never truly alone. Remember that God's hands are steady, firm, and unshakable. They will hold you up when everything else around you seems to be falling apart. When you can no longer see your way forward, God's hands will guide you, one step at a time. You might be going through a season of pain, loss, or confusion, but know that God's hands are still at work in your life. His hands have the power to bring healing, restoration, and new beginnings. The hands of God are not just hands of support, they are hands of transformation. Think about how the Lord shaped the world with His hands, how He formed the first human being from the dust of the earth. Those same hands are at work in your life, molding you into the person you were meant to be. You may not understand the process, and it may seem painful at times, but trust that God is shaping you, refining you, and preparing you for greater things. Every trial, every hardship, every moment of growth is part of the process. God's hands are working within you, crafting you into His masterpiece. Sometimes when we face challenges, we start to doubt our worth. We wonder if we are truly loved or if we are worthy of God's attention. But let me remind you, God's hands are on you and He doesn't make mistakes. You are not here by accident. You are not a mistake. You are a child of the Most High God, and He has a purpose for your life. The same hands that created the universe have been placed upon you, and that means you are significant, You are loved and you are chosen. There is no situation that can erase your value in the eyes of God. He sees you, he knows you, and his hands are upon you. Sometimes we try to take control of our own lives thinking we know best, but there are moments when God's hands need to take over. You may feel like you are in control, but ultimately it is his hands that shape the course of your life. Trusting in God means surrendering to his will, allowing his hands to guide you, even when it's hard to understand the journey ahead. But when you allow his hands to lead, you are walking in the fullness of his purpose for you. His hands will take you to places you never imagined, but only if you trust him enough to let go of your own plans and follow his lead. When you walk through the fire, know that God's hands are there to hold you. When you face temptation, his hands are there to steady you. When you feel lost, his hands are there to guide you. Whatever the circumstance, God's hands are on you, and that changes everything. You are not walking through life on your own. You are not facing your battles alone. God's hands are upon you, and with his hands you can do all things. You can overcome any obstacle, face any challenge, and achieve the impossible, because his hands are on you. God's hands are hands of mercy, hands of grace, hands that reach out to the lost and broken. There is no place you can go where his hands cannot reach. There is no sin so great, no failure so deep that his hands cannot redeem. When you fall, his hands are there to pick you up. When you are weak, his hands are there to strengthen you. When you are lost, his hands are there to guide you home. The mercy and grace of God are limitless, and they are available to you right now. There is no need too big, no dream too small for God's hands to touch and transform. When you recognize that God's hands are on you, something powerful happens. You begin to walk differently. You begin to see the world through the lens of his grace and provision. You begin to trust more, to believe more, to love more. You realize that no matter what you face, God's hands will never leave you. And with that knowledge, you can face anything with confidence, knowing that you are not in this alone. God's hands are on you, and that changes everything. You are never forgotten. You are never abandoned. You are never without hope, because his hands are always on you. So let this truth settle deep in your heart. God's hands are on you. They are steady, they are sure, and they are filled with love. They are holding you up, guiding you, and shaping you into the person he created you to be. There is nothing that can separate you from the love of God, and his hands will never leave you. Trust in his hands today. Let them guide you, comfort you, and transform you. When God's hands are on you, there is nothing that can stand against you. No matter the challenges you face, God's hands are always there to provide for your needs and protect you from harm. His presence in your life offers unwavering support, guidance, and security, even when circumstances seem impossible. Just as God created the world with his hands, he is at work in your life, shaping and refining you for his greater purpose. The difficulties and trials you encounter are part of the process through which he is molding you into who you are meant to be. No matter how lost or broken you may feel, God's hands are filled with mercy and grace, ready to lift you up, restore you, and redeem you. His love is unconditional, and there is no place or situation where his hands cannot reach you. In every moment of life, whether you're experiencing joy, sorrow, victory, or defeat, there is a constant truth. God's hands provide and protect. These hands are not mere symbols of divine power, but a profound expression of love, care, and presence. It is easy to forget in the midst of our struggles, but the reality remains that God's hands are always at work in our lives, offering provision and protection when we need it most. No matter how uncertain or difficult life may appear, we are not walking through this world alone. God's hands reach out to us in ways that go beyond our understanding, giving us what we need to survive and thrive, and guarding us against the dangers we cannot see. There are times when we feel like we are facing the impossible, as if the weight of the world is on our shoulders and there is no way out. In those moments, it's easy to feel abandoned, as though God is distant or uninterested in our struggle. But in those very times, God's hands are reaching down, offering support and stability. Sometimes we may not even realize it, but God's provision doesn't always come in the way we expect. His hands don't always give us everything we think we need immediately. Instead, His provision often comes through the quiet moments, the small blessings, and the unexpected ways He meets us in our struggles. Think about the Israelites wandering in the desert, hungry and uncertain. God provided manna from heaven, food they couldn't have imagined, sustenance in a place where there was nothing to sustain them. They had no idea where their next meal would come from, but God's hands were working in the background, providing for their needs in ways that could only be described as miraculous. Likewise, when we face situations that seem bleak, we often wonder where our provision will come from. It is in those moments that we must remind ourselves that God's hands are at work and His timing is perfect. He knows exactly what we need and when we need it. His provision may not always match our expectations, but it is always perfect and sufficient. Protection is another fundamental aspect of God's hands. Life is full of unseen dangers, spiritual battles, and forces that we cannot always understand. Every day we face challenges and temptations that can threaten to overwhelm us. However, God's hands are there, constantly guarding and shielding us from harm. His protection is not always visible, and often we don't recognize the unseen dangers He has shielded us from until much later. But the reality is that we are never truly alone in the battles we face. When we are unaware of the dangers that surround us, it is God's hands that are keeping us safe, often preventing us from falling into traps or walking into situations that could cause us harm. This protection isn't limited to physical danger. It extends to our hearts and minds as well. In a world filled with distractions, negativity, and spiritual battles, it is easy for our faith to falter or for us to lose our way. But God's hands protect us from the mental and emotional attacks that threaten to derail us. When we are struggling with doubt, fear, or insecurity, it is God's hands that steady our hearts, bringing peace in the midst of confusion. The protection He offers isn't just physical, it is an emotional and spiritual covering, helping us stay grounded in Him when life seems chaotic. There are also times when we may feel that we are walking through storms in our lives, facing difficulties that seem insurmountable. It's easy to think that we are alone, that no one can help us through these trials. But even in the fiercest storms, God's hands are holding us up. Think of Peter walking on water toward Jesus. When the storm raged around him, he took his eyes off Jesus and began to sink. But Jesus reached out His hand and pulled him up. Just like Peter, we may be walking through our own storms, but God's hands are always there to reach out and pull us up when we start to sink. It is in those moments of fear and uncertainty that God's protective hands are the ones that hold us steady, offering us stability when everything else feels like it's falling apart. Sometimes we don't even recognize the protection God is offering until much later. We may look back on a difficult situation and see how He was at work behind the scenes, shielding us from consequences that could have been devastating. There are countless times when we have walked through life not realizing that God was actively protecting us from harm, either by redirecting us away from dangerous situations or by preventing things from happening that could have led to pain or loss. In moments of frustration or confusion, it's easy to forget that God's protection is often working behind the scenes, unseen but powerful. The hands of God also offer provision in more than just physical need. Yes, God provides the food we eat, the shelter we have, and the health we enjoy, but He also provides the strength, wisdom, and grace we need to endure life's challenges. Sometimes the provision we need isn't material. It's the strength to keep going when we feel like giving up. There are moments in life when we are simply exhausted, when the weight of our circumstances seems unbearable, and we don't know how we will make it through another day. It is in those moments that God's hands provide what we need most, the strength to keep moving forward. This provision also comes in the form of wisdom and understanding. We face countless decisions in life, and it can be overwhelming to know what direction to take. But when we trust in God's provision, we also trust in His wisdom to guide us. His hands offer the discernment we need to make the right choices, to stay on the right path, and to avoid pitfalls that could lead us astray. The provision of wisdom is often one of the greatest gifts God offers, especially when we are in uncertain or difficult situations. Protection and provision are often closely linked because without one, we cannot fully experience the other. God provides for our physical, emotional, and spiritual needs, but He also shields us from the things that would cause us harm. This twofold action of provision and protection is an ongoing process in our lives. We may not always see how His hands are at work, but we can trust that they are. He is always present, always providing, always protecting, and the more we understand this truth, the more we can live with confidence, knowing that no matter what comes our way, God's hands are there to hold us, to provide for us, and to protect us from the dangers we cannot see. There is nothing that can separate us from the love of God, and there is nothing that can remove His hands from our lives. No matter how hard the journey may seem, we can always take comfort in the fact that God is with us, providing and protecting every step of the way. His hands never leave us, and as we learn to trust in His provision and protection, we find that we are more resilient, more confident, and more capable of facing the trials of life. God's hands are upon you, and through them, you are given everything you need to endure, to thrive, and to live the life He has called you to. God's hands are not just hands of protection and provision, they are also hands of transformation. From the very beginning, the Creator's hands have shaped and molded the world, bringing something beautiful and purposeful out of nothing. He shaped the mountains with His hands, breathed life into the dust of the earth, and formed each of us with care and intentionality. Just as God's hands have the power to create and transform the physical world, they also work within our hearts and lives, shaping us into who we are meant to be. The process of transformation is not always easy or quick, but it is always purposeful and filled with grace. It is through God's hands that we are refined, molded, and transformed into the likeness of His Son, becoming the people we were created to be. Transformation is often a gradual process. Just as the potter carefully works the clay, molding it into something beautiful, God takes time to shape us, allowing us to become the individuals He has designed us to be. In our moments of struggle and hardship, we may feel as if we are being broken down, but in reality, God is doing something deeper within us. When we face challenges, when we experience heartache, or when we find ourselves in situations that seem beyond our control, it is often in these moments that God's hands are at work in the most profound ways. Just as the potter must apply pressure to the clay to shape it, God sometimes allows pressure in our lives to refine us, to strengthen our character, and to build our faith. When we allow ourselves to be shaped by God's hands, we are transformed from the inside out. It is a process that involves surrendering our will and our desires, allowing God to take control and lead us on the path He has planned for us. This transformation isn't always comfortable, and it doesn't always happen according to our timeline or expectations. There are times when we resist the process because we don't understand what God is doing, or we fear the change that He is bringing about. But God's hands are gentle and firm, always leading us toward a better future, even when we cannot see the full picture. His purpose for our lives is far greater than our understanding, and the transformation He brings is always for our good. Think about how a caterpillar undergoes the process of metamorphosis to become a butterfly. This process is not an easy one. The caterpillar goes through a time of complete transformation, breaking down and rebuilding itself in a new form. In the same way, God often brings us through seasons of change that may feel painful, but in the end, they lead to growth and new life. The caterpillar must surrender its old way of being in order to emerge as something new and beautiful. Likewise, we must surrender our old ways of thinking, our old habits, and our old desires in order to experience the full transformation that God has in store for us. God's hands shape us not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. He is at work in every area of our lives, refining our character, purifying our hearts, and molding us to reflect His love and goodness. There are times when God's hands work in ways we don't expect or understand. But His wisdom is perfect and His purpose is always good. When we go through difficult seasons, it is easy to question God's intentions. But it is in these moments that God is often doing the deepest work within us. Just as gold must be refined in the fire, our faith and character are often refined in the heat of life's challenges. God's hands are constantly at work, shaping us, making us stronger, and preparing us for the plans He has for us. One of the most profound aspects of God's transforming hands is that He doesn't just shape us in a general way, but He shapes us with purpose. He created each of us uniquely, and His transformation in our lives is tailored to who we are and what He has called us to do. The gifts, talents, and abilities that God has placed within us are a reflection of His intentional design. God's hands are at work, not just changing us for the sake of change, but molding us into the individuals we were meant to be, equipped to fulfill the specific purposes He has for our lives. When we look at the story of Joseph, we see an example of God's hands shaping and transforming a life. Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery and imprisoned, all for crimes he didn't commit. From the outside, it seemed as if his life was falling apart. But God's hands were at work in Joseph's life, shaping his character, teaching him humility, perseverance, and trust in God's timing. Joseph didn't understand why he had to endure so much hardship, but through it all, God was preparing him for a greater purpose. Eventually, Joseph was elevated to a position of power in Egypt, and his ability to forgive and show mercy was a direct result of the transformation that God had brought about in his life. The trials Joseph endured were not for nothing. They were part of the process through which God shaped him for the role He had prepared him for. The transformation that God brings about in our lives is not just for our benefit. It also has a ripple effect on the lives of others. When we allow God to shape us, we become more reflective of His love, mercy, and grace, and that transforms the way we interact with those around us. We begin to show more kindness, more patience, and more understanding because we are being shaped to be more like Christ. Our transformation impacts our relationships, our work, and our communities. God's hands are not just shaping us for our own sake, but for the sake of others, so that we can reflect His glory and point others toward Him. Sometimes the process of transformation is hard to accept. We live in a world that values comfort, instant results, and control. But God's transformation works in opposition to the world's standards. God's hands often lead us into uncomfortable situations, challenge our preconceived notions, and take us on paths that we would never have chosen for ourselves. Yet these very things are what mold us and refine us. We can either resist this transformation or allow it to take place, knowing that it will result in something beautiful, something greater than we could have imagined on our own. The beauty of being shaped by God's hands is that He doesn't force us into transformation. He invites us to surrender and trust in His process. God does not impose His will on us. He gently guides us, shaping us with love and grace. We have the choice to resist or to embrace the work He is doing in us. When we embrace His shaping, when we surrender our wills and trust in His plan, we allow His hands to mold us into the people He created us to be. And in doing so, we experience a deeper, more profound transformation that is both fulfilling and life-changing. Transformation is not a one-time event, but a continual process. Just as the potter doesn't stop shaping the clay after the first few turns, God is always at work in our lives, continually refining, continually molding, continually shaping us into something new. Every day is an opportunity for God to work in us and through us, bringing us closer to the people He has designed us to be. The process may take time and it may require patience and perseverance. But God's hands are steady, sure, and unchanging, always leading us toward a future that is filled with hope and purpose. There is no more profound expression of God's love and character than his hands of mercy and grace. In a world where judgment and condemnation often seem to reign, God extends mercy and grace to us with open hands. These hands are not hands of punishment, but of compassion, offering forgiveness and second chances, even when we feel undeserving. His mercy is the unmerited kindness he bestows on us, and his grace is the unearned favor he offers, even when we have failed. The beauty of God's hands is that they hold out mercy and grace to all who are willing to receive them. These are not hands that condemn or strike down, but hands that heal, restore, and transform. Mercy at its core is God withholding the punishment we deserve. We have all fallen short of God's perfect standard, and we all carry the weight of sin, shame, and failure. Yet, instead of punishing us as our actions deserve, God offers mercy. He looks at our brokenness, our mistakes, and our failures, and with a heart full of compassion, he chooses to forgive. The weight of guilt and shame that we carry is lifted because of God's mercy. His hands reach out to lift us out of despair, to cleanse us from sin, and to offer us a new beginning. This is not a mercy that is earned, nor is it something we can ever repay. It is a mercy that is freely given, an expression of God's infinite love for us. In our human nature, we often think that we must earn forgiveness, that we must do enough to make up for our wrongs or deserve God's favor. But God's mercy is not based on what we can do. It is based entirely on his character. He is a God of compassion and love, and his mercy flows from that unshakable foundation. When we are in the deepest pits of our mistakes and failings, when we feel as though we are beyond redemption, God's hands are still extended toward us, ready to offer mercy. He doesn't look at us with condemnation, but with the eyes of a loving father who desires to bring his children home. This mercy is what allows us to stand before God, not in shame, but in the freedom of forgiveness. Grace, on the other hand, is the undeserved favor of God. While mercy withholds the punishment we deserve, grace gives us blessings that we haven't earned. Grace is the gift of God's favor, lavished upon us not because of our own goodness, but because of his great love for us. When we are unworthy and undeserving, God still chooses to pour out his grace upon us. This is the essence of God's love. He gives us what we don't deserve simply because he is good. It's not something we can earn through our actions, nor can we ever repay it. Grace is freely given without expectation, and it is in God's grace that we experience the fullness of his love. Grace empowers us to live lives that reflect his goodness. When God extends grace to us, he not only forgives us, but also equips us to walk in his ways. Grace is what enables us to overcome our past mistakes and walk in newness of life. It is through grace that we are empowered to live with purpose, strength, and freedom. Without grace, we will remain bound by our past, by our failures, and by our shortcomings. But with grace, we are set free to pursue the life God has called us to love others as he has loved us, and to become the people he created us to be. Sometimes we may struggle with the idea of grace. We may think we don't deserve it, that our failures are too great for God to forgive, or that we must somehow earn his favor. But grace is not about deserving. It's about God's goodness and kindness toward us despite our imperfections. It's a radical kind of love that breaks through our self-imposed barriers and reaches into the deepest places of our hearts. God doesn't wait for us to get everything right before he extends his grace to us. He offers it freely, right where we are, knowing that it is only by his grace that we can be transformed. God's hands of mercy and grace extend to us not only in our moments of failure, but also in our moments of strength. Even when we succeed and walk in obedience, God's grace is still with us. His grace is not a one-time event, but a continuous flow in our lives. It is a grace that sustains us, strengthens us, and guides us every step of the way. Even when we walk in the fullness of his blessing and favor, we are still in need of his grace to remain humble, to stay grounded, and to keep our hearts focused on Him. God's hands of grace are not just for the moments when we've fallen. They are with us every day, covering us, leading us, and transforming us. God's hands offer grace even when there are times when we walk through life with little understanding of the depths of God's mercy and grace. We may face hardships or challenges and wonder why they're happening, but even in those times, God's grace is at work. His grace is in the midst of the struggle, working to strengthen us, grow our faith, and teach us to trust in Him more. Even when life feels hard, God's grace is not absent. It is often in our trials and difficulties that we experience God's grace in the deepest ways. Through trials, God refines us, shapes our character, and prepares us for the greater things He has for us. We are also called to extend the same mercy and grace to others that God has extended to us. Just as God has shown us unmerited favor, so we are called to show that same favor to those around us. This is not always easy. People wrong us, hurt us, and disappoint us, and sometimes we feel that they don't deserve our forgiveness or grace. But God's hands of mercy and grace are extended to us in spite of our own shortcomings. And as we receive that mercy and grace, we are called to pour it out on others, reflecting the love of God to a world in desperate need of it. When we forgive others, when we show kindness to those who have wronged us, we are embodying the very nature of God's hands. God's hands of mercy and grace are not limited by our understanding. In the world's eyes, mercy and grace often seem unfair. Why should someone who has done wrong be forgiven? Why should someone receive favor when they haven't earned it? But God's ways are higher than our ways, and His understanding surpasses our own. His mercy and grace are not bound by human logic. They flow from a heart of unconditional love that desires to redeem and restore. God's hands reach out to us, offering what we can never earn, and in doing so, He invites us into a relationship of grace. When we receive His grace, we are transformed, and we are called to be agents of that transformation in the world around us. God's hands of mercy and grace are not temporary, they are eternal. They are the hands that reached out to us when we were lost in sin, and they are the hands that continue to offer forgiveness, hope, and love throughout our lives. No matter how far we fall, no matter how much we fail, God's hands are always extended toward us, ready to lift us up and restore us. His mercy and grace are not based on our actions, but on His unchanging nature. Because of His love, He continually offers us mercy and grace, never tiring, never giving up on us, and always inviting us to experience the fullness of His forgiveness and favor